Excuse me. I hate to interrupt conversations, especially productive conversations, but we need to adhere to a schedule. By the way, all these seats in the front, which say reserved, are reserved for you. So please occupy them. It's much easier to make eye contact with people who are nearby than those who are distant. You'll also understand what I'm saying. My name is Dick Brown. I feel enormously honored to be included in this program. A program, when I looked it over some weeks ago, struck me as a gathering of all-stars, where I felt I'd like to go and get some autographs. I don't have bona fides in history of Reconstruction. However, and please forgive this shameless plug, I have recently completed a book called Self-Evident Truths, Contesting Equal Rights from the Revolution to the Civil War, and it does include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Our panelists today are Stephen Berry, who is the Gregory Professor of the Civil War era at the University of Georgia. He specializes in the history of 19th century American South. He is the author or co-editor of 6 books and oversees the web project CSI Dixie. Berry's work has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the ACLS, among others. He's currently working on a book titled The Black Prince, The Emancipated Life of Prince Rivers of South Carolina. Our second speaker today is Douglas Edgerton, Professor of History at Le Moyne College. He has taught at Le Moyne since 1987. He's held visiting appointments at Colgate, Cornell, University College Dublin. He's the author of 8 books, including the Lincoln Prize co-winner, Thunder at the Gates, The Black Civil War Regiments That Redeemed America, Heirs of an Honored Name, The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America, He Shall Go Free, The Lives of Denmark Vesey, also The Wars of Reconstruction, The Brief Violent History of America's Most Progressive Era, Year of Meteors, Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, and the Election That Brought on the Civil War, Gabriel's Rebellion, The Virginia Slave Conspiracies of 1800 and 1802, and Death or Liberty, African Americans and Revolutionary America. He has published essays and reviews in the New York Times, The Nation, and the Boston Globe. Bruce Levine is the J.G. Randall Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's published 4 Civil War era books, most recently being The Fall of the House of Dixie, The Civil War and the Social Revolution That Transformed the South. His current project is a book about Thaddeus Stevens, Stevens' political evolution, and the revolutionary role he played in the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it's now in press with Simon & Schuster. Our final presenter this morning will be John Stauffer, Cates Professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard. He's the author or editor of 20 books, over 100 articles, something compulsive about that, which focus mostly on anti-slavery, social reform, or photography. The Black Hearts of Men was the co-winner of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize and the Lincoln Prize second place winner. His Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, was briefly a national bestseller. His most recent book, Picturing Frederick Douglass, was a Lincoln Prize finalist. He has published essays and reviews in Time, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and of course in a variety of journals and books. He served as consultant for several exhibitions and films, including War Photography, The Abolitionists, Django Unchanged, and The Free State of Jones. First, we will have Stephen Barry on The Black Prince, The Emancipated Life of Prince Rivers of South Carolina.
Well, thanks very much. I'm going to swell the chorus thanking Manisha and Juliet. I've run some of these smaller conferences myself. I've never run one this well. I know how much work it is to herd all these academic cats, so I really appreciate it. In 1513, I'm going to have to figure out how to advance the slide. You got it? I just point at you? Not yet. Back it up. Awesome. Okay, in 1513, an Italian diplomat, Niccolò Machiavelli, wrote a letter to his prince offering some metaphorical advice. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, Machiavelli said, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten the wolves. The American slave Prince Rivers was the lion and the fox. He is the most consequential American about whom Americans know nothing. During the American Civil War, Rivers was the tip of the Black Spear, the first of the first, Color Sergeant, Company A, 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the highest-ranking black member of the 1st Black Regiment mustered into Union service. The 54th Massachusetts, made famous by Matthew Broderick and the movie Glory, came later and was fundamentally different, composed primarily of northern-born free blacks. With the exception of its white officers, Rivers' 1st South Carolina was composed entirely of former slaves. Their families were often still in bondage. They fought not for an abstraction, but for wives, sisters, children, and parents. They fought the war for what the war would mean. And this is the best picture I have of him. This pixelated disaster is the best I can do. Like many of the enslaved, Rivers' exact birth date and most of his biography is difficult to establish. The 1870 census gives his age as 45, which means he's born around 1825. He almost certainly didn't know his own birthday. He picked Christmas. He apparently didn't know his own father. We also don't know how he learned to read and write. After joining the USCT, Rivers' colonel said of him, "He writes well enough to prepare for me a daily report of his duties in the camp." In a deposition related to his pension, his daughter Patty White said that Rivers was raised in the white folks' house. It is possible that one of the whites helped educate him, that they would have been flouting the law to do it. Probably Rivers learned the way Frederick Douglass did, by craft and cunning and an implicit understanding that literacy would unlock sentiments that lay slumbering. Slide. We do not know what we do know is that Rivers was enslaved to Henry Middleton Stewart. During his enslavement, we know that he was recognized throughout the South Carolina Low Country as a crack coachman and a stellar boatman. Metaphorically, Rivers always knew where he was going, even if he never could go where he pleased. Frederick Douglass captured a similar feeling, watching from his plantation as the little white triangles of boat sails on Chesapeake Bay appeared and disappeared on the horizon. "You are loose from your moorings," he told the ships, robed in purest white, "while I am fast in my chains." Slide. We also do not precisely know how Rivers made his escape to become a soldier and color sergeant for the 1st South Carolina. The likeliest scenario suggests that its Federals began their operations along the South Carolina coast, culminating in the Battle of Port Royal in early November 1861. The Stuarts fled inland to Edgefield, where they had extended family. After ferrying the Stuarts to Edgefield, Rivers probably unloosed the carriage and raced the horse back to the Yankees along the coast, probably meeting up with them in Beaufort. When he got there, we don't know what he precisely said to the presiding General David Hunter. We do know how he felt. When asked in August 1862 by James Miller McKim, a Presbyterian clergyman and anti-slavery advocate, why the slaves had not risen en masse before now, Rivers was very clear. There was no defeating the slave power without an army. Denmark Vesey had tried and been hung. Nat Turner had tried and been hung. John Brown had tried and been hung. What would have been the use? Rivers told McKim. We would have had no chance. No gun, no sword, no knowledge, no chance, no nothing. But suppose you had a chance, McKim then asked him. Would you all fight then? Yes, Rivers replied. I know we would. Only let us know for sure, mind you, that the white people mean right. Let us know for sure that we're fighting for ourselves, and I know we will fight. Well, Prince, McKim responded, wouldn't you call this a good chance? Yes, sir, I do, Rivers said. And then I tell my people this may be our last chance. That's the reason I joined as a soldier. When asked by another reporter if his people were ready to fight, Rivers was blunt. This is our time. If our fathers had had such a chance as this, we should not have been slaves now. If we do not improve this chance, another one will not come, and our children will be slaves always. His white commanding officer, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, said Rivers had no equal. There's not a white officer in this regiment who has more administrative ability or more absolute authority over the men. He is jet black and very handsome, with a figure superior to that of any of our white officers, being 6 feet high, perfectly proportioned, and of apparently inexhaustible strength and activity. His gait is like a panther's. I never saw such a tread. No anti-slavery novel has described a man of such marked ability. If his education had reached a higher point, I see no reason why he should not command the Army of the Potomac. Would have been better. And if there should ever be a black monarchy in South Carolina, he will be its king. On April 1, 1863, Lincoln himself wrote to General Hunter to congratulate him on the bright reports coming out of Florida. I'm glad to see the accounts of your colored force at Jacksonville, he noted. The enemy will make extra efforts to destroy them, and we should do the same, to preserve and increase them. When it came to formerly enslaved troops, the real question for Lincoln had never been, will they fight? But will they show restraint? Will they show mercy, even when they have their feet on the necks of their former masters? This is exactly what Rivers and his men had done in Florida, and upon reading of their exploits, Lincoln summoned his Secretary of War and formally charged him with the creation of the USCT. Slide. After the Civil War, Rivers was elected to South Carolina's State House for the first and last time in its history. A Southern legislature reflected the racial composition of the state. As a House member, Rivers worked tirelessly toward one end, the formation of a new county, Aiken County, South Carolina. His reasoning was simple. African Americans could never be protected in the United States unless they built sanctuary cities deep in the heart of Dixie, places where blacks and their white allies could control the government and live in harmony. To create a sanctuary city in the 19th century South, you had to create a sanctuary county. You had to control the sheriff, coroner, the local magistrates, and the local courts. As soon as his county was created, Rivers quit the legislature and moved there. The State House, he knew, had accomplished all it could. What was left to fight for would have to be fought for on the ground. Slide. For a decade, Rivers presided over the town of Hamburg as the unofficial mayor. There he became known as the Black Prince, the power of Aiken County, the Grand Chief of the Dusky Ku Klux, a sort of anti-Klan, and the Masaniello of South Carolina, an allusion to the common fisherman of Italy who led a rebellion to become Viceroy of Naples. Hamburg had first been settled in 1820 and quickly became a thriving hub of the overland cotton trade. Gradually, wagon traffic declined, railroads expanded, and Hamburg became a sort of spur town. After the Civil War, African Americans specialized in such places. At base, it was a real estate problem. One reason the church so dominated African American life in this period is that it was the only building they owned. And so of necessity, it became a rec center, a school, a daycare, a dance hall, and a hub of cultural life. As a black sanctuary city, Hamburg multiplied all of these functions 100-fold. For 10 years, Rivers presided over his sanctuary, 80% black, 20% white, all of them perfectly happy. But on July 4, 1876, the city militia was parading on the streets when two whites pulled up in a wagon and demanded to drive through the parade. It was the opening salvo in a several-day saga known as the Hamburg Riot, and more appropriately, the Hamburg Massacre. I always remind my students, why was so much Klan violence necessary? Because more than 100 years ago, it was all working. Reconstruction was working. Slide. The architect of the Hamburg Massacre was Matthew Calbraith Butler. Butler had lost a foot at Brandy Station, and the war had ruined him financially. In his own run at Congress, and in a bid to equal his father and grandfather, he had been defeated by a black man. When he tried to take it out the loss on local blacks, they appear to have burned down his house. Utterly unreconstructed, Butler was an unstable compound of gentility and rage. With all of his beautiful manners, Mary Chestnut said, when he wanted to, he could be the most cold-blooded, insolent human being that mortal eyes ever beheld. Slide. During the massacre, most of Rivers' militia holed up at the Sibley building. It's the larger building just to the right of the trestle works, second trestle works. Fighting a way out was impossible. They had few rounds, fewer guns, and faced a vast mob, all armed with the Winchester, the gun that won the South. Negotiating a way out was probably impossible too, though Rivers worked tirelessly to find a solution. As the sun went down, the white men got drunker, and at 6 p.m. they opened fire. The first person shot was actually a white man, McKee Merriweather, perhaps by friendly fire, we're not sure, peeking out to squeeze off a round from behind one of the trestles. Of course, the death of a white man only enraged the mob further. After dark, I could hear them coming across the bridge from Augusta, said a witness, yelling, whooping, and hollowing. I heard them when they brought the cannon across the bridge. The mob used the cannon to blow the doors off the Sibley building. The militiamen attempted to escape out the back of the barracks. They were rounded up and were put in what would later be called the dead ring. The prisoners sat on the grass within a densely packed ring of whites. Some were leading black Republicans or members of Rivers' militia. Others were simply Hamburg men and women against whom other men had grudges. Charles Attaway, lieutenant in the militia, was among those in the dead ring. Mays, what do you think of this? Attaway asked the man sitting next to him. Jack Mays had been a cook for the Union Army. Now, by all accounts, he ran a gambling operation in Hamburg. I don't know, Attaway, what to think of it, Mays responded. Do you think they will kill any of us? Yes, I do. I think so. Just so, said Mays. Do you think they will kill me? Attaway asked finally. I do, said Mays. All you have got to do now is pray to God to save your soul. Just give up your wife and children and everything else, for they are going to kill you. With that, Attaway hung his head and commenced crying. Slide. The next morning, July 9, Prince Rivers stood over the bodies of his militiamen and convened a coroner's inquest, because that is what you do the day after a massacre. That is the first link in the chain of justice. When the inquest was over, Rivers bundled together the pages of testimony and issued arrest warrants for 87 white men, including Matthew Butler, future South Carolina governor, and Ben Tillman, future South Carolina governor. That inquest made the Times, names were named, but the judicial process went no farther. The straight-outs were in a sentence. Reconstruction was rolling back. Slide. In 1916, a marker was erected for the lone white killed in the massacre. In life, he exemplified the highest ideal of Anglo-Saxon civilization, says the inscription. By his death, he assured to the children of his beloved land the supremacy of that ideal. After the unveiling of the marker, they screened Birth of a Nation. Slide. What happened to Hamburg? After the massacre, Rivers' dream of a sanctuary city began to fade. In 1877, the new state legislature revoked the town's charter, decapitating Wakanda in a way that really hurt. In 1911, the Savannah River flooded, devastating what was left of the town. This flood devastated majority white Augusta as well, but Augusta had the financial resources and the federal pull to reinforce its levees. Hamburg did not. The next flood came in 1929, and Hamburg washed away. Black property owners couldn't afford to rebuild, and whites began snapping up the real estate, wiping out 2 generations of heritable black wealth. Today, Hamburg is the golfing community of Riverwalk. Hamburg has been rechristened North Augusta. Slide. Today, people golf on Hamburg's graves. Slide. The roads that run through the town are wide and well appointed. Slide. The homes are decorous and perfect. Slide. And the site where Moses Parks, Alan Attaway, David Phillips, Hampton Stevens, and Albert Miniart were summarily executed. Slide. The road that runs above the site of their murder is the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway. Slide. So what happened to Rivers? To Rivers' dismay, there were no more links in the chain of justice. He told his son Joshua, who was interviewed by the WPA, now it'll be 100 years. With no other options, Rivers returned to the carriage. Attired in his livery suit and tall beaver hat, said an admiring white witness, he looked like a piece of statuary. So erect in form was he. The entire arc of Rivers' remarkable life, carriage driver, soldier, legislator, mayor, carriage driver again, captures the window of opportunity that opened and closed on a remarkable generation of African Americans. Rivers never sought our pity. He sought a country worthy of his name. He sought to build a better world. Amid the calls for resistance, sanctuary cities, and a third Reconstruction, we would do well to remember a forgotten leader of the first resistance and the first Reconstruction, the original Black Panther, the man who spoke for the choked voice of a race, at last unloosed when he exhorted his men to arms. This is our time. The enslaved leave their traces on the historical record in snapshots and glimpses. We find them enumerated in a shipping manifest, on a bill of sale, buried in probate proceedings as part of a property dispute. Rarely can we see them whole, on their own terms, in their own words. American law, that great producer of paperwork, regarded the enslaved as property, not people, and so they had to live their lives in the interstices of the historical record, in defiance of the documents that sought to pin them down as things. Prince Rivers may not have left a record rich enough to sustain a continuous biography. But like a bolt of lightning over a darkened landscape, his record roars to life. In scenes so searing, they stir the blood or break the heart. And then all goes dark again as he recedes into shadow, sometimes for years at a time. Slide. What if we decided to make the lacuna and caesura of Rivers' remarkable life work for us rather than against us? Slide. What if we could start for the premise that there are things that he does not permit us to see? What if, like any man, Rivers had defilade positions of the heart he wanted no man to get a bead upon? Slide. What if we understood the gaps in his historical record to be the measure of his mystery, the preserver of his dignity, and a statement of his refusal to be re-enslaved? If true, this is how it should be. This is how we know we are meeting him on his own terms. The Black Prince can't be a story told about him. It has to be a story told by him, fashioned solely from the materials on which he made his mark. And make no mistake, Prince Rivers made a mark. He will be on a stamp one day. He will be on a bill. He will be on the big screen. His destiny is not fixed, but still unfolding. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks to Richard for that lovely introduction. Thanks to Manisha for the lovely conference and for inviting me to be here. I'm not sure who's in charge of the weather, what has done to my voice, so I've got my water. I'll try to hang in here. This story starts with a speech. An aged veteran who was never one to back down from an argument, even as a young man. His father whose father was a very cold, stiff person. I routinely admonished him to be a nicer person and less rude. Son of the 67-year-old former cavalryman chose the University of Chicago, nestled in the land of Lincoln, as the site for his lengthy 1902 tribute to Confederate General Robert E. Lee, whom he praised as the highest type of man and one deserving of a statue in Washington. News of the speech spread quickly, and the old soldier was soon invited to speak at the College of William and Mary, the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, and Washington and Lee College. By 1907, the speech, now entitled Lee's Centennial, had grown to 75 minutes, yet at each stop, Confederate veterans flocked to hear him discuss Lee as a very perfect character. Each audience rose in applause, and the usually dour speaker confessed himself gratified by the praise of so many good people, so simple, straightforward, and genuine. Good people on both sides, perhaps. In some ways, the story appears to be unexceptional. We all know, of course, that by the Jim Crow era, Confederate reunions always extolled the virtues of Robert Lee. The South was being peppered with emergence of monuments dedicated to the lost cause. What made the story unusual is that the speaker was Charles Francis Adams, Jr., a former colonel of the Massachusetts 5th Cavalry, the first black cavalry unit, and the son and grandson of anti-slavery politicians and diplomats. So entranced was the white South with this Adams, having so despised his grandfather, John Quincy, that Lyon Tyler, the president of William and Mary, and himself the son of John Quincy's political enemy, assured Charles Francis that, quote, if the matter were left to the South, the Adams family would have the honor of another representative in the president's chair. So this talk is taken from my forthcoming book, Heirs of an Honorable Name. Shameless plug, it'll be out in October. Makes a great, if depressing, Christmas present. What I do in the book is chronicle in the decline and fall of America's political dynasty by following the fortunes of the family's third and fourth generations. The Adamses were brilliant, accomplished, highly educated, always Harvard, ambitious and diligent. They were also uniformly caustic, disagreeable, unhappy, overly competitive, often racist, sometimes anti-Semitic. Being an Adams was both a blessing and a terrible burden. Simply to bear that surname meant one was automatically considered for any political opening. Anytime there was an opening anywhere in Massachusetts, a paper would say it's got to be an Adams. But to be the descendant of two presidents also meant that every generation expected great things of themselves and of their progeny. The saga ultimately is a story of a nation and a Republican Party in steady flight from its wartime ideals. The last two generations, the third and fourth Adamses, rather like the party they had helped build in the antebellum years. Settled instead into the spoils of Gilded Age America, they both reflected their party's retreat from progressive ideals and helped to shape that retreat. I mean, one must remember, the Adamses were not simply a political dynasty. They were the only political dynasty. Of the early American presidents, from Washington to Jackson, only John Adams had a white son who lived to adulthood. Imagine the burden of being the child of a president. Charles Francis Jr. was the descendant of two American presidents. Of the 6 children of Charles Francis Sr. and Abigail Brooks, Charles Jr., the third child and second son, was the Adams most likely to achieve national fame and the most unlikely to denounce Reconstruction era reforms. Today overshadowed by his younger brother Henry, due in large part to Henry's Pulitzer Prize winning education of, a volume, by the way, that Charles Francis dismissed as simply silly. Charles was doomed to remain behind in Quincy when his father was appointed by Lincoln as the minister to Great Britain. Charles Sr. took Henry with him as his secretary, and Charles Jr.'s job was to remain behind and watch the family investments. Adamses didn't fight. Adamses were statesmen. They were diplomats. But then Charles Jr. watched all of his Harvard friends leave, join the army, fight. After the debacle at Bull Run, he began to believe it, quote, an actual disgrace that his family, of all possible families American, had been wholly unrepresented in the field. So Charles writes to his father and says, someone from this family has to serve, and Charles Sr. from London just doesn't write back. So finally, Charles Jr. just goes ahead and joins on to the 1st Cavalry. His father, by the way, never wrote back to approve or disapprove, simply tried to pretend his son was not in the military. As was the case with many northern boys, the war provided Adams with his first view of the South and plantation slavery. His regiment in early '62 arrived on the Carolina coast near Port Royal. He rode out with his regiment to see an abandoned plantation on Barnwell's Island. And curiously, the grandson of a man who had defended the Amistad captives before the Supreme Court expressed little pity for the roughly 7,000 black contraband who crowded into Beaufort. And his letters to his family betrayed the first hints he would never truly come to understand the black men he would later lead into battle. He thought the refugees, quote, lazy and submissive, although those traits he at least attributed to their white masters. Otherwise, his stereotypical view of African Americans reflected not only the worst of class biases, but also an inability to understand the slave survival mechanisms. The freedmen were intelligent enough, he assured his father, but their intelligence too often takes the form of low cunning. Adams believed them dishonest, a theory he never dropped. As did all good Republicans, Adams was confident that the war would be the undoing of slavery, quote, not by any legal quibble of contraband or theories of confiscation, but simply by stimulating free trade. Northern travelers often remarked on Southern poverty, and as he rode along Carolina's shore, Adams thought himself, quote, amidst the institutions of the Middle Ages. Coerced slave labor, he believed, was awkward, expensive, and behind the age. And so the liberation of its working class would be the greatest blessing which could happen to the South. But what of the former slaves, or as Adams indelicately put it, how to resolve the Negro question? And he did not use the word Negro. And part of my subtitle of the book is The Decline of the Adams Family. Charles Francis Sr., in his diary, always remarked on race, but in kind of a benign sort of way. He would say things like, I shared the stage today with the Negro Douglas, or I was talking to the colored man Remond. But even in the privacy of his journal, Charles Francis Sr. never used the N-word, whereas for Charles Francis Jr. and his older brother, John Quincy II, they almost never used the term Negro or colored. It simply is always the N-word. Initially, Adams had been against black military service. He changed his mind in July of '63, following the attack on Battery Wagner by his state's 54th Infantry, which of course proved the worth. In early '64, he signed on as the second in command of the Black 5th Cavalry, and after his superior was wounded in battle, Adams rose to command the regiment. Unhappily, the years had not altered his opinions of blacks. Of their courage and action, he conceded, there can no doubt exist. But of their physical and mental and moral energy and stamina, I entertain grave doubts. Although sound enough as infantrymen, blacks, Adams maintained, were, quote, wholly unfit for cavalry service, lacking absolutely in the essentials of alertness, individuality, reliability, and self-reliance. A few of the wealthy white officers in any of his state's black regiments had been close to black men before the war, despite what you see in Glory, where Rob Shaw has a black friend as a kid, which is not true. But most had abandoned their genteel racism as they came to know and respect their men. Only Adams, surrounded by dark-skinned freedmen, never grew to appreciate the men he led, no matter how well they performed. At least Adams considered the Army was, quote, the proper school for the race. For the Army, they learned to take care of themselves. It never occurred to Adams, evidently, that while enslaved, his recruits had cared for themselves, their families, their masters' horses, all without the supervision of Boston Brahmins. For Adams, the pinnacle of his service arrived on April 2, '65, when he and his regiment rode into Richmond, which had fallen to U.S. control only that morning. Leading his men through the streets, the young colonel wondered at the good fortune that has brought me here today. To have led my regiment into Richmond at the moment of its capture is the one event which I should have desired as the culmination of my life in the Army. And interestingly, in his diary that day, it's the only time he refers to his men as Negroes, which is to say he doesn't use the N-word. Adams mustered out that August at the age of 30 and returned to Newport to marry his fiancée, Mary Elizabeth Ogden, who came from even more serious money than the Adamses. Upon hearing that he was home and safe, Charles Francis Sr. remarked that this act of the drama is over for his son. And for his son it was, as was the case with far too many Republicans, especially those who came from wealth and education. The fight was over because slavery was dead. Far more than his father, who was a state legislator in the 1840s, had championed the end of a racial ban on marriage, had banned state officials for helping federal officials with runaways. Charles Francis Jr. was merely opposed to slavery rather than for any manner of social reform. Nor were his brothers, John Quincy II, Henry, Brooks, all agreed that Reconstruction was a complete disaster. Although only Charles had actually been south of Washington City, all four accepted the complaints of white Southerners, to quote the actual facts of Reconstruction. Writing from a secretarial post in London, Henry thought the political scene queerly confused in America. Charles Sumner, an old family friend and sometimes rival, was in an amusing hurry to get into opposition with President Johnson. Why so fast? Henry wondered. We have done with slavery, he told Charles. Let us give time. It doesn't matter how long. I have doubts about black states. I fancy white makes for better breeding stock. All four brothers were horrified by the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, even more so by the 14th Amendment. Progressive Republicans in Congress, Henry fumed, were violating the rights of minorities more persistently than the worst pro-slavery Congress ever did. Curiously, by describing Southern whites as minorities, a demographic situation that of course appeared only in 2 Southern states, Henry sounded more like the deceased John C. Calhoun than he did his own father, who had appeared beside Frederick Douglass and Wendell Phillips in Boston rallies condemning the Fugitive Slave Act. John Quincy II, in fact, did more than merely complain about Republican politics. The eldest of the 4 brothers and an honorific Civil War colonel for serving on Governor John Andrews' staff, John Quincy had the following year taken his father's advice and run for the state assembly in 1865 as a Republican. Within 2 years, though, he had abandoned his party for the Democrats. As he explained in an 1868 speech in South Carolina, though he was named for his grandfather, quote, one of the earliest opponents of a peculiar institution, this Adams regarded Republican policies as vindictive and unconstitutional. Speaking to any freedmen who might have been in his audience that day, John Quincy warned them that he feared, quote, their present importance in politics is likely being used for purposes that are dangerous to their well-being. The speech, published in pamphlet form, drew high praise from Charles Francis Jr., who gushed that it was full of broad views of statesmanship, such as are not common in these days of bitterness. Henry agreed the Republican Party had betrayed its trust when it came to guarding the Constitution and applauded John Quincy's address. John alone has acted the part of a man, he mused. No less than Robert Barnwell Jr., the son of the fire-eating editor of the Charleston Mercury, invited him to Charleston, where Adams condemned universal male suffrage. For his part, Charles Francis Jr. rejected all attempts to get him into office. Instead, armed with his father-in-law's business connections, he became a typical Gilded Age Republican by assuming the directorship of the Union Pacific Railroad. As an observer, he continued to sour on politics and regarded President Grant as an unqualified spoilsman. But it wasn't just Grant's corruption that bothered him. It was Grant's support for black voting rights. On both 1872 and 76, he and Henry lobbied in behalf of their father's unsuccessful bid for the Republican presidential nomination. And late in life, even Charles Francis Sr. Became a Democrat and supported Tilden in 76, met with Tilden on numerous occasions in New York. And somebody thought that what the party was doing was just completely wrong. Quote, universal suffrage, the former colonel remarked in 1869, echoing the sentiments of his brother John Quincy, can only mean in plain English the government of ignorance and vice. It means a European and especially Celtic proletariat on the Atlantic coast, an African proletariat on the shores of the Gulf, and a Chinese proletariat on the Pacific. As a railroad baron and an avowed enemy of the Knights of Labor, Charles Francis was not merely indifferent, but openly hostile to Reconstruction reforms. Perhaps because he regarded the freedmen's demand for economic rights as similar to the claims advanced by immigrants who built northern railroads. We cannot live forever on the dry dusk of the anti-slavery agitation or upon the animosities of the late war, he wrote Henry. That long battle is over. After Jay Gould forced Adams's resignation from the Union Pacific in a hostile takeover in 1890, Charles Francis had leisure time to write and speak across the South. And another depressing reminder that the Adams brothers' retreat from Reconstruction reflected white Republican conciliation as much as helped to shape it. Ohio-born historian James Ford Rhodes wrote to congratulate Charles Francis for his hard, scientific way of looking at the issue of race. The dawn of the 20th century found Charles Francis spending almost as much time speaking across the South as he was at home in Massachusetts. Rural vistas were not to his taste, and he complained that parts of the South had changed very little from his days in Virginia and South Carolina during the war. Parts of the Old Dominion, he confided to his journal, were the same old Negro, and again, that's not the word he used, the same old Negro-ridden Virginia. He drops the N-word like he has Tourette's. It kind of falls into place. In a series of articles published after 1900, he went after Reconstruction. One thing is clear, he wrote in the Century magazine in 1906. The work done by those who were in political control at the close of the Civil War was done in utter ignorance of ethnological laws. Freed people, he added, should have been dealt with not as political equals, much less forced into a position of superiority. It's not clear where exactly that happened. It says a lot that the white press in the North pretty much left him alone, maybe simply because he was an Adams. But the black press really went after him, and rightly so. The Indianapolis Freedman dubbed his century essay unfortunate and hoped that Adams, once admiring populace, might now abandon him. Those witless theorists who maliciously insist the Negro is incapable of progress, the editor insisted, will continue to flock to his lectures. Chicago journalists found it curious that while Adams believed the whole Negro race to be utterly inferior and despicable, he thought all white men splendid species of enlightenment. Charles Francis Jr. died on May 20, 1915, 1 week shy of his 80th birthday, and 108 years after the birth of his father. The son had never cared for his father. Writing his published autobiography that as a youth he found his father rigid, narrow, and even less companionable than his grandfather John Quincy. Perhaps, therefore, to an extent, Charles Francis Jr.'s disinclination to emulate his father's youthful crusades for black rights was a lifelong act of rebellion against parental authority. But the four Adams brothers were hardly alone in turning their backs on civil rights. The Adams family saga ultimately was a disastrous political story that echoed a northern abandonment of its too brief crusade to forge an interracial democracy in the wake of the Civil War. For a time, ironically, reformers and Republicans of both races who had grown disillusioned with Grant's governance initially looked to the next generation of Adamses to help steer the party and the Republic back to its 1840s progressive roots. Instead, family patriarch Charles Francis Sr. lost his chance and maybe his nation's in refusing to fight for the nomination in 72 or 76, and so the party of Lincoln fractured, and the progressive vehicle Charles Francis Sr. had actually helped to create in the 1850s devolved into a lobbying group of and for robber barons and imperialists. Tragically, as the post-war country ceased to be a nation that he much recognized or cared for, Charles Francis Jr. proved to be willing to abandon his family's legacy, cash in as a railroad magnate, and bask in the applause of lost cause generations. Thank you. And sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Let me join the list of people thanking Manisha and Juliet for this really excellent conference. I think we're all enjoying it, and I have a hard time remembering a better conference that I've been to, certainly in quite a while. Like one of the panelists earlier this morning, the title of my paper also needs slight modification. Thaddeus Stevens, The Making of a Revolutionary, is really the prospective title of the forthcoming book. But today, what paper really should be called Thaddeus Stevens on Morals, Law, and Compromise. Civil War and Reconstruction, as we all know, richly deserve the name the Second American Revolution. And Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania was decidedly a revolutionary. Hard to find the contrast clearer between him and the individual about whom we just heard. Stevens was among the first to recognize the Union cause's implicitly revolutionary nature and to demand that the Union act accordingly. He consistently fought in Congress for the anti-slavery and anti-racist policies necessary to accomplish the revolutionary transformation that he sought, policies to which some other Republicans would, of course, come around only later. He demanded a constitutional amendment outlawing slavery throughout the United States a year before Abraham Lincoln endorsed that idea. In the first years of Reconstruction, he demanded equal civil rights for African Americans, soon including the rights to hold office and vote. Voting fighting for those things before most of his Republican congressmen colleagues endorsed them. And he demanded the confiscation of the large slaveholders' estates and their division among former slaves. So if Abraham Lincoln was, in Jim McPherson's terms, a reluctant revolutionary, Thaddeus Stevens was a very eager one. Now, biographies have not neglected Stevens. By my count, 10 authors published book-length studies about him since his death, and the last few were very conscientiously researched, and all of them contain valuable information about their subject. But all of them, I think, also fail to identify clearly the specific nature of Stevens' core beliefs, and as a result, the specific meaning of his particular type of democratic radicalism and the historical context in which it took shape have been, in my opinion, insufficiently explained. In this connection, two 20th century scholars portrayed Stevens in sharply conflicting ways. Hans Traefus dubbed Stevens a 19th century egalitarian. And that's true, but that's not a very precise label. In Stevens' era, after all, self-styled egalitarians came in many shapes and sizes, including laissez-faire libertarians, women suffragists, land reformers, trade unionists, utopian colonists, socialists, anarchists, and others, all depending on how they defined equality. Richard Current objected to calling Stevens any kind of egalitarian, arguing that what motivated Stevens was not the achievement of human equality, but merely his own frustrated personal ambitions and his desire to support Northern industry. In the process, according to Current, doing his part in bringing about the age of big business. These two historians seized upon aspects of the Pennsylvanian's outlook without, I think, grasping its essence. Professor Current's attempt to counterpose Stevens' devotion to that economic system and counterpose that to his fervent hostility to human slavery was misguided. There was no contradiction between those two things. The particular variety of egalitarianism that Stevens espoused drew inspiration from and sought to advance and spread and make more egalitarian and more democratic the system of free labor capitalism then developing in the United States North. Another historian, Bob Cook, has aptly said of the leading moderate Republican of that era, Fessenden, that he always regarded Reconstruction as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be grasped. And that was true of Republican moderates generally, but it was emphatically not true of Thaddeus Stevens. For him, the Civil War and Reconstruction represented precisely an opportunity to complete, or in his words, perfect, a revolutionary transformation of the country that had already begun during the Civil War. Since youth, Stevens said one day, he had fondly dreamed that when any fortunate chance should have broken up for a while the foundations of our institutions, the nation would then reconstruct all our institutions, stripping them of every vestige of human oppression, of every vestige of inequality of rights. He saw Reconstruction as an opportunity to bring the country's laws and government into fuller accord with the Declaration of Independence assertion of human equality. And doing that, Stevens explained, would require not only abolishing slavery, but also working a radical reorganization in Southern institutions, habits, and manners, and revolutionizing their principles and feelings. Although trained as a lawyer, Stevens was not especially concerned with whether his program accorded with the dictates of the Constitution or other existing laws. What guided him was what he judged to be the needs of this democratic capitalist revolution. The clearest example of this approach of his, I think, can be seen in his justification for confiscating property and slaves. Seizing an enemy's property and slaves was necessary to suppress the planters' rebellion, and in his mind, such seizure was therefore legitimate. He found a legal endorsement of his prescription in the law of nations. In a fight for its very life, he said, citing the authority of the 19th century Swiss scholar Aimé de Vattel, the United States was obliged to do whatever was necessary for victory. But when the war itself was won, Stevens simply modified his argument. Having suppressed the rebellion and begun emancipation, the Union must secure these wartime accomplishments and continue to perfect the Republic by ensuring equal rights for black and white. That goal was the sole standard against which the rightness and wrongness of future government action must be judged. Implicit in this line of argument was a more general belief that an appropriate end justifies and dictates the means needed to achieve it. And that claim, of course, was and is commonly deplored in the name of absolute moral standards of right and wrong that transcend time, place, and circumstance. But Thaddeus Stevens considered his own understanding of the relationship between ends and means to be both irresistible and unassailable. Some worried that such reasoning and the precedents they justified could also rationalize tyranny, to which Stevens responded simply by directing attention back to the specific ends being sought in every case. That was the way to evaluate the legitimacy of means being invoked. And thus he noted both the wartime Union and the leaders of the pro-slavery rebellion claimed extraordinary legal government powers. Must we honor both sets of claims? Of course not, Stevens replied. We uphold one claim and we reject the other because of the very different ends that each actually serves. In the Union's case, he said, extraordinary power is granted for good, while in the Confederacy's case, extraordinary power is seized for mischief. Stevens' attitude toward impeaching Andrew Johnson reflected a very similar method, I think. Once again, he was choosing and justifying methods, means, according to whether they served the goals that he sought, goals whose value he considered of paramount importance. To be sure, Stevens did try to fit his argument into the narrow framework that the Constitution specified as appropriate grounds for removing a president from office. That is, the violation of law. And so Stevens did accuse Johnson of violating his constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And he did argue that everything Johnson did in trying to control the War Department was done to obstruct the execution of the law in the South. The fact that Johnson was a lawbreaker was not Stevens' core reason for trying to remove him from office. At bottom, the Pennsylvanian was far less concerned with punishing someone he strongly disliked, and there was not much question about that, nor penalizing past crimes, than he was for clearing the paths by removing Johnson of future positive action. As with the extraordinary measures that he had championed during the war, Stevens shaped his Reconstruction policies with concern less for the formal legalities involved than the ends he deemed urgent. He thus told his party's caucus in early January 1867, according to a reporter, that Republicans needed to remove Johnson because, in his words, it was impossible to reconstruct the South with Andrew Johnson as president. And when a Democratic congressman denounced impeachment's motives as political, Stevens could only agree. The fight to remove Johnson, he freely acknowledged, was, quote, wholly political, end quote, in purpose. That is, it was indissolubly bound up with a struggle over government policy. Johnson's removal was necessary, he said, to protect the liberty and happiness of a mighty people and take care that they progress in civilization and defend themselves against every kind of tyranny. How am I doing in time? 2 minutes. Let's see if we can manage that. But if Stevens was resolute in seeking to do what the democratic revolution required, he was also capable of realism when confronting insurmountable obstacles to doing what he thought should be done. Contrary to his reputation in some quarters, he was flexible enough to compromise when he judged compromise necessary. But he did generally insist on staking out his own position, his own preferences, and doing that clearly and publicly, and settling for less only when he judged that unavoidable and without concealing what he thought was being lost in the compromise. And this became clearest during Reconstruction when he found himself unable to pass a version of the 14th Amendment that he favored, and to settle for one that would punish less severely a rebel state that failed to enfranchise blacks. He openly acknowledged the shortcomings of the weaker version of the amendment that he felt constrained to support. "It falls far short of my wishes," he told the House of Representatives. But he had been compelled to recognize that the partial measure then being considered was all that can be obtained in the present state of public opinion, because the public mind has been educated in error for a century and was therefore unreceptive to doing what needed to be done, what equal rights required. Believing then that this is the best proposition that can be made effectual, he said, I accept it. To have allowed it instead to die would have postponed the protection of the colored race perhaps for ages, he said. He would not do that. He would not throw away a great good because it is not perfect. I will take all I can get in the cause of humanity and leave it to be perfected by better men in better times. In acting in this way, let me say in closing, and in explaining himself publicly and clearly in this way, Stevens, I think, was providing a textbook lesson in how to accept a necessary compromise without abandoning or concealing one's own political position. He agreed to this less than ideal, what he called short step toward black suffrage, because he had no way of achieving his preferred measure. But he made perfectly clear to allies and supporters both his own views about both the general subject and the limitations of the compromise under consideration. By refusing to pretend that the compromise measure was better than it was, he readied those allies and supporters to fight for something better when conditions allowed. Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha, for putting together this extraordinary conference. Thank you, Richard, for the wonderful introductions. I'm going to focus on Charles Sumner and his role in Reconstruction. Like Thaddeus Stevens, Sumner was an enthusiastic revolutionary. He is best known today as having been almost caned on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks, and a number of Civil War books suggest that he almost had it coming to him because he was such an unlikable figure and his speeches were so outrageous that it was hard to for his opponents not to engage in physical violence. He has long been misrepresented. Sumner is still seen as a Boston Brahmin, and yet he did grow up on Beacon Hill, but on the north slope of Beacon Hill. His father was a bastard child of a Revolutionary War veteran. Both his father and his grandfather went to Harvard, but his grandfather was there as a charity case, meaning he essentially received a fellowship. He was only there 3 months, served in the Revolution, following the Revolution, he spent time in South Carolina, hence Charles Pinckney's, from the family name, from South Carolina, part of the large Pinckney family. But Charles Pinckney Sumner was educated because Job Sumner, his father, lost his money in land deals and speculations in South Carolina, but some Revolutionary War friends of Job Sumner agreed to fund Charles Pinckney Sumner's education at Harvard, where Charles Pinckney attended Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Charles Sumner was the oldest of 11 children and was the only one to go to college. His father was he rose to the chief of police of Middlesex County, which was essentially a plebeian position, and Sumner was the only child to go to college or to go to Harvard, received some aid for doing so. He is, to give you a sense of his personality, he was known as being a great conversationalist. He had numerous friends who were political opponents in a sense. So one example is Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne was a lifelong Democrat. One of Hawthorne's closest friends was Franklin Pierce. Hawthorne wrote the pro-slavery biography of Franklin Pierce. And Hawthorne also voted for Charles Sumner for the Senate. They were close friends. They were willing to put aside their differences. Another friend of Sumner was George Hilliard, who was his law partner. Hilliard eventually would become a Copperhead Democrat and during the Civil War and write the campaign biography for George McClellan, but they remained on cordial terms. Sumner, in the best way to summarize Sumner's enthusiastic revolutionary vision was the phrase that he repeated throughout his adult career, advocating equality before the law. And in fact, he is sometimes regarded as having brought that phrase, equality before the law, into the English language from the French. And he was enthusiastically borrowed from international laws and legal traditions to the United States Constitution. In one sense, his tenure or his contribution to the Reconstruction begins with his advocacy for revising the 13th Amendment. As you all know, the clause of the 13th Amendment of exempting or allowing slavery for those convicted of a crime comes from the Northwest Ordinance, and a number of congressmen felt it was very important to have the language of precedent so that people could not question the validity of the 13th Amendment. Sumner recognized that that clause could open the way for essentially creating a condition of unfreedom for blacks and suggested a new clause in the 13th Amendment in which he said all persons are equal before the law so that no persons can hold another as slave. Unfortunately, that did not go through. Freedmen, he advocated, like Thaddeus Stevens, should be established on former plantations. They should become proprietors. The plantation should be broken up. Freedmen should have parts of it. In a sense, he advocated, and Sumner recognized and was an important player in the Port Royal experience, which we now know was actually successful for freedmen. Freedmen and women became successful artisans, farmers, and black families owned the land in Port Royal from the end of the war, many families through the early 20th century. They were not rich, but they were independent entrepreneurs, artisans, and essentially fulfilled the free labor ideal of the Republican Party before the war. Sumner advocated that rebel states should not re-enter the Union without all persons being guaranteed equality before the law. He and many others at the time, at the end of the war, recognized that the rebels had committed treason, and the crime for treason was execution. And he wrote, our rebellion, and he advocated this, our rebellion should close without capital punishment. The men who have made so many tombs and vacant chairs must not be allowed to govern again, and blacks must be protected. But he advocating driving out all the leaders of the country, permanently deporting them, and not letting them return as a punishment, not letting them come back to their plantation and try to reconstruct the old order. In the very first civil rights bill that was passed in 1866, which Sumner supported, he did not draft that, he didn't write it, but in his support of it, his vigorous support of it, he received one of, and I'll just give you this anecdote, one of countless attacks and threats from Southerners who absolutely hated him. One Southerner, we don't know his name, from Richmond, Virginia, sent Sumner a letter, and in the letter was a severed finger from an African American. There's blood all over the letter, and he wrote, I send you a piece of one of your friends. If that bill of yours passes, I will have a piece of you. Sumner, in my view, well, before I go into that, let me just summarize. Sumner was willing to, and essentially sacrifice much of his political career in Congress in opposing Grant in 1872 over the Grant administration's attempt to annex Santo Domingo. And Sumner thought that was an outrageous and horrible idea, in part because his father, Charles Pinckney Sumner, as a young, poor teenager, goes to sea, and he goes to Saint Domingue, and he's in Saint Domingue in 1794, after the Saint Domingue Rebellion, before the creation of Haiti. And Charles Pinckney Sumner, Charles's father, sits down to dinner with the slave rebels and toasts them and advocates for their victory. And Charles Pinckney Sumner and Charles Sumner always understood the symbolic importance of Haiti as the world's first black republic and wanted to defend it. And Charles Sumner during the Grant administration's attempt to annex Santo Domingo, recognized, first of all, that, in fact, Grant often said, not just Santo Domingo, which is now Dominican Republic, but Grant said, annex the island, which is also Haiti. And Sumner understood that if Santo Domingo were annexed, that would be the soon end of Haiti as a black republic. And he also recognized it could serve and would serve, and a number of Republicans were suggesting this as a site for colonizing blacks outside of the continental United States. He vigorously opposed it. In fact, he sided with a third party, with Horace Greeley, in 1872, lost a number of, was opposed by a number of friends, including Frederick Douglass, and it cost him the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations, because Grant, in a sense, took vengeance on him. The Civil Rights Bill that Sumner first issues in May of 1870 had huge significance at the time, and its legacy, I think, is one of his most significant contributions. First of all, the Civil Rights Bill emphasizes equality before the law. It also includes vigorous penalties for people who violate the Civil Rights Bill, and it advocates integration in every single public establishment, restaurants, schools, graveyards, every place. And the framework for it is that because all humans are endowed with imagination by God, all humans have the inalienable right to cultivate the imagination and are equal in their capacity to imagine a better future and reflect on the past, to look outside the present, to reform themselves and their society. In Sumner's bill, a person who opposed it would receive a $500 to $1,000 fine, plus an imprisonment that would be between 30 days and 1 year, and there would be no exceptions to that. A corporation who violated the Civil Rights Bill would forfeit its corporate charter or its license, which essentially would lose its ability to operate. And no person could be disqualified as a juror. Any law discriminating against persons of colors would be repealed and annulled. His last bill, which he argued for in Congress a few months before he died in early 1874, resembled his first bill from May of 1870. This, as a way to, in a sense, honor Sumner, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 served as that purpose. A number of scholars have pointed out the 1875 Act, in part, was a way to honor Sumner, but it was a profoundly watered-down bill in that it did not provide the enforcement clauses that were so important to Sumner's Civil Rights Act, and it did not desegregate or integrate a number of crucial public establishments, including schools and graveyards. The longer legacy of the Sumner's Civil Rights Bill is that Brown v. Board of Education, and Thurgood Marshall himself was very familiar with Sumner's work. Edward Pierce's, I still think, is the best biography, the brilliant 4-volume biography of Sumner in the late 19th century. Marshall read, we know that because he quotes from it, at least some of Sumner. Brown v. Board of Education did what Charles Sumner had urged as early as the 1840s in the Roberts v. City of Boston case, in interpreting the Constitution not by precedents of the past, but by social realities of the present. 1870s, the Civil Rights Act was, in a sense, a form of judicial and social pragmatism, anticipating the judicial philosophy of Louis Brandeis, Holmes, Marshall, and other reformers. And Sumner, in Roberts v. City of Boston, that's where he first invoked equality before the law, where he's defending desegregation of schools in Boston before the Lemuel Shaw, the Supreme Court Justice of Massachusetts, where he invokes the French. He uses the term from the French law principle of equality before the law, which Sumner sees or argues in this case is implicit in the Massachusetts state constitution. I'm almost done. And the Massachusetts state constitution, Sumner uses the Massachusetts state's constitution as part of his efforts to include the Equal Protection Clause as part of the philosophy of the 14th Amendment. In the largest sense, the Declaration of Independence was the guiding rule of the Constitution for Sumner. But he went further than that. He looked outside the Constitution itself for new rules of interpretation, and especially in international law. He was one of the, in terms of his legal writings, one of the most knowledgeable legal writers on international law in his day. Joseph Story was one of his main mentors. The other was John Quincy Adams. He anticipates Louis Brandeis, who reacted against the rigor of narrow mechanical jurisprudence that applied old rules to new situations. Thank you.
So we're open now for questions. Yes. Our question from Amy Drew Stanley is, were the revolutionaries interested in a revolution in law, relatively narrowly defined, or were they interested in broader forms of revolution?
It's a great question. Thank you, Amy. So Sumner definitely understood that he was trying to revolutionize the law, and he understood what he was up against by borrowing from French law, by borrowing from international law, and but he was very self-conscious about what he was trying to do. Something that I think was helpful for him was that the foundation was always the Declaration of Independence. And so he looked back to the Declaration and saw in it, in its language, the possibility for then borrowing from equality before the law in France. And that becomes very important in his arguments. In terms of his land redistribution, it was also framed in a legal sense. Sumner was very familiar with history of certainly the 1848 revolutions and what happened to the losers in war. What happened to losers in war is that most of them would lose land and lose property. And if you, especially in the 1848 revolutions, the revolutionaries had taken up arms against an existing government. And in the United States, which is a democracy, and Lincoln himself suggested the degree to which secessionists, I mean, he didn't even dignify the term by calling it the Confederacy. They were rebels. Legally, what is the definition of a rebel? A rebel is someone who takes up arms against an existing government. What's the punishment for the crime of taking up arms against the United States government? It's execution. Everyone at the time looked at the example of John Brown. John Brown, who was, even though people sympathized with him, Lincoln was representative. He said that John Brown, we cannot help but sympathize, he said this a few times, not all the time. We cannot help but sympathize with Brown's principled opposition to slavery, even though he was justly executed because of treason. And so Sumner was very explicit about recognizing or arguing that the punishment for the crimes of rebel leaders should be execution. But let's provide them a kind of amnesty by deporting them.
And of course, Stevens and Sumner were in sync on a lot of questions, probably most questions. But Stevens' eye was on the prize of revolutionizing society. I don't mean that as a distinction from Sumner, but I mean, that would be my answer to Amy's good question. He was looking to revolutionize society and enforcing that change in the law. So first was society, second was the law, and he was, one might say, a little cavalier about the law. The excellent editors of his papers basically said he picked and chose among the laws he would cite in support of what he wanted to do according to which fit. And he makes the argument at one point when he's arguing for territorialization, flat out, not on legal grounds. He said, it has to be. We have to treat these as conquered provinces, not as internal rebellion by itself, because only if we treat them as external enemies will the law then allow us to do what we really need to do, which is step in and completely transform this society.
I'll just pick on Adams one more time, because, of course, he had been very close friends with Charles Francis Sr., with Sumner, and they have, sorry again about the voice, they have a spectacular falling out during the secession winter. And the Adamses found it very hard to be friendly with somebody they disagreed with. And Charles Francis Sr. had been very close friends with Richard Henry Dana, and just could not get behind the grasp of war theory. So for moderates like Adams, people like Sumner and Stevens were really kind of tearing up the fabric of American democracy. And so they did recognize exactly how radical these guys were. And in fact, when Stevens dies, Charles Sr. says in his diary, well, he was insane. That's the word he used. He was insane, and he was kind of on the right side of history, but he was insane, and now he's gone. And that's not really a bad thing. And that's pretty much his view. When Sumner dies, they ask Adams to say a few words at Faneuil Hall. He said, no, I don't do that kind of thing anymore. So the moderates of the party did recognize how radical these guys were.
Yes.
Sure. Right. So,
The question concerns graphic novel biography, more traditional biography. Please defend.
sure. So the first thing is that it isn't a graphic novel. I would prefer to call it a graphic history, right? Because everything that everybody says is a quote. Sorry. Everything that's said in the book is a quotation from a source. So it's a graphic history, not a graphic novel. The only thing that is not a direct quotation from a source is the book that Prince Rivers is writing, essentially, which is he serves as the narrator. So I would prefer to call it a graphic history. I actually think that historians have been somewhat less creative in thinking about their forms and formats than they are about virtually every other endeavor of their research and writing life. And I think we live in a time now where I think we have both maybe more opportunity and even sometimes more of an obligation to fit our work both to the subject and then to the public. So in the case of Prince Rivers, this was a guy with a staggering amount of gravitas and a staggering amount of swagger. And so the form that fit him to me, or the form that he sort of asked me to put him in, was this particular form. It is also true that his historical record makes that, because he's so alive in glimpses and moments, but unsustained. You can accomplish that with biography, but it takes a lot of that fill, where you're talking about ancillary matters or contextualization. That's great. I've done that too, but I wanted this to be him, only him, all the way through, and so I thought it was a better format.
It's a great question. So I'm working on a book the working title is Charles Sumner's America, a cultural biography in history and memory. And so as a cultural biography, other models that I think have been really magnificent and illuminating and in a sense kind of models would be one, William Cooper's Town, most of you are probably familiar with, Walt Whitman's America. I think those are two of many examples. And for someone like Sumner, who is, as I said, a revolutionary, it offers a way to explore the degree to which he is essentially a creature of his own time and place, but the way he can transcend in certain ways some of the prevailing norms and customs and traditions, and also highlight what's possible for someone, what's possible in this moment. In the largest sense, what are the boundaries of permissible and impermissible dissent or protest or radicalism. And Sumner, I think, recognized that some of his, whether it's in his, some of the, his legal arguments, that it stepped over what was the boundaries of permissible dissent, as in his Civil Rights Bill. But I think that someone like Sumner and someone like Frederick Douglass, during the war, and a lot of Americans during the war understood that this was a revolutionary moment. And I still think that David Bryan Davis's understanding of the temporal nature of revolutions are really helpful. In The Problem of Slavery and Age of Revolution, he describes the perishability of revolutionary time, especially in a democracy, and a democracy which has a two-party system where change is more difficult, and revolutions open up this possibility for very quick change. Think just of the Reconstruction amendments. 3 amendments passed, 3 constitutional amendments passed in 5 years. I mean, what are the chances of that happening right now? I mean, it's never even come close another time. That captures the degree that it's this revolutionary moment. And Sumner and Douglass, they recognized that this window is not going to last. So we need to institute structural change now or as soon as possible, because if we wait too long, we're out of luck. And I think that's another way that a cultural biography can help understand broader currents of society.
Bruce, did you want to comment?
Well, just briefly, what I've been trying to do with Stevens is, as any good biographer tries to do, is really put him in his context. Frederick Douglass famously says that the inexorable logic of events is going to drive the Republican Party to do what needs to be done. In a certain sense, I think, Stevens tries to be the voice of the logic that Douglass is referring to. Because just because there's a logic of events doesn't mean everybody is going to perceive that logic or follow that logic. So somebody needs to be driving the point home in the halls of government. And he's trying to do that, and I think it's crucial to see that what he does is in the context of what people like Prince Rivers and other slaves and freeborn black people are doing, but cannot express in government. Somebody else says of Stevens that he brought the spirit of John Brown into politics, and I think that captures it too. But if you see him in isolation, he seems too much to be a prime mover rather than part of a process.
We're kind of out of time, but I wanted to take my advantage of being here with the microphone to ask a question of John and Bruce regarding their subjects, and I wondered particularly if you would comment on the extent to which they socialized across race boundaries, to what degree they had African American friends.
Thank you. I didn't have time to, that could have been another whole talk. Sumner, he grows up in essentially a integrated neighborhood, the only integrated neighborhood in Boston, the north end of Beacon Hill, which is the site of much of the black leadership in the United States. So David Walker lives, I've actually walked it 2 minutes from Sumner's boarding house where he grew up. William Cooper Nell is about a minute walk from where Sumner grew up. Lewis Hayden is about a minute or 2 minute walk. Mariah Stewart lived right next to David Walker. And so Sumner, from the time he's a boy, is walking the streets and is living in a integrated society with other friends. And he remains lifelong friends with William Cooper Nell and a number of African Americans. He receives more letters from African Americans as a senator, especially in the wake of his civil rights bill, than, so far as I know, any other white American, as a tribute for their respect. And numerous facts, he was close with Frederick Douglass, and one of the testaments of their friendship is that Douglass supports Grant in annexing Santo Domingo, as one of the emissaries who goes to Santo Domingo to help negotiate it. So they are vigorously opposed on this important issue in 1872. It doesn't affect their friendship, and in their letters when they're debating it, what you see is this profound respect. Henry McNeil Turner was another friend who said that Sumner would ask me to lunch as though, you know, it was just the most natural thing in the world to do. And I think part of it is where Sumner grows up. He grows up in a community, in a democratic community in which blacks and whites are equal citizens. And I think that had a huge impact.
So you saw the Spielberg movie about Lincoln and see Stevens in bed with his asserted paramour. This is a real woman, an African-American woman whom he hired as a housekeeper in the late 1840s. Rumors flew that they were in fact lovers. There actually is no evidence that that was true, but what does seem clear is that they were close friends and had many friends in common, and both of them were hooked up with the Underground Railroad. Stevens was, in a certain sense, fraternizing with African Americans in death, quite famously. Stevens chose to be buried in the only cemetery in his town that allowed black and white people to be buried in the same cemetery. And in fact, that is the inscription on his monument. He says, to paraphrase him because I can't remember the exact quote, I choose this area of relative solitude not out of aesthetic preference for the area, but because this is the only cemetery in which this can take place, and I therefore try to embody in death as in life the necessity of the equality of human beings before their God.
It's always good to end. When Charles Francis Jr. is the colonel in the 5th Cavalry, and he's there for a year, he never once mentions in his diary or in letters that the corporal in his regiment is Charles Douglas, who transferred from the 54th. And so the fact that his father and Frederick shared the stage together, he either doesn't know or just doesn't care that Douglas's son is one of his junior officers. And so that's kind of how disconnected he is, even from black guys in his own regiment.
Thank you all very, very much.
Turned in my second version to the publisher, waiting for her to render her judgment.
Way ahead of me.